Welcome to the Real Bible Rob podcast, and today we're going to talk about hell. and To hell with hell, as Amy Jill Levine says, one of my favorite biblical scholars. But anyway, today what I'd like to do is instead of like going in and proving whether hell is real or not, I'll talk about that a little bit. But mostly, I want to talk about the utility of hell and what it means when we talk about hell, because that's really important. Many times, people, cling very hard to the concept of hell that they were taught because it plays such a central role in their theology and the idea of salvation and whether it's real or not. That's a huge thing. But instead, let's talk about the history of it and the utility of hell. And I think that when you look at it that way, you can see that, well, there is room for rethinking hell. And so let's get started. The uh, key verses here are a vision of hell that comes from Luke 16:19 through 26, which is a very visual way, the most visual way that hell is seen in this parable, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus and Father Abraham. Uh, and then that's conflated with a couple of other places where, like Lucifer falling from the sky, which is in Isaiah 14, and the idea of the fiery pit in Revelation 19. But mostly I'll focus on Luke 16 and how this parable, remember, it's a parable. Jesus is not saying this is what it really is like. He's just saying he's using a parable based on the idea of Hades that was happening at that time. So let's get into a little bit more about what the history is and why it's used as it is. I actually wrote a couple of sermons, delivered a couple sermons on heaven and hell when I was going through chapter by chapter Revelation a couple years ago, and this really came out of it. And I said, "Shh, I'll let you in on a little secret. It's okay, I promise. It's okay to say that you don't believe in hell." And I was wondering, were people going to get really mad at me and grab me by the collar and throw me out? I said, really, you can be Bible believing, you can be a faithful Christian and ask these questions. And it's not watering down the gospel to ask these questions because you really got to look at what is hell? What's the definition of it and where did it come from? Because, like I said, it's not so much whether you can prove that it exists or not. You really can. I mean, it's a theological concept, right? But you have to understand that it comes from Catholic dogma. The doctrine of hell is Catholic dogma, and that it comes from, and it was very, very useful to the Catholic Church as it was developed. It was a tool, and it was a very central role in the concepts of salvation, soteriology, the sacramental system, and what you do there. And that tool was used throughout time. And the modern concepts that we have of hell developed much later than most people realize. That it's not really in Scripture as it came from. It started with Tertullian. Tertullian was a Latin-speaking Roman theologian, and then and he, that sort of that dualism that we have got really applied by Tertullian, and then where the Catholic Church really picked it up is from Augustine and the idea of original sin, the idea of total depravity, and through original sin, all humanity is doomed to hell unless we get off the train, unless we accept and get salvation from Christ, through Christ. And that idea had been around there a long time. But even Augustine had doubts about the idea of eternal damnation. So when we talk about hell, what we talk about as Protestants and Catholics is we're talking about something called eternal conscious torment. And that is a place where you go to be tormented for eternity if there's no escape. You go there based on whether you've received salvation in this life, whether you've been a good person in this life, some theologies, or not. But that idea is only one of many, but it's the one that's so dominant that that's what we think. And this really came around in the systematic theology of Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. That's where it started becoming developed, when this idea of eternal conscious torment became much more the main concept of hell. And like I said, the Catholic Church found it extremely useful. You can keep people in line. You can threaten them essentially, threaten their eternal salvation, so that you can keep them in line theologically. Also, keep them in the sacramental system, and make sure that they, are getting baptized. Make sure that they are going to confession. Making sure that they take communion. Making sure they get their last rites, and all of those things. No better way to motivate people to do all of these things and to look to the authority of the church is what they really ultimately wanted, than to say, if you don't do those, then you're doomed to hell, obviously, right? But eternal conscious torment is only one idea of hell. The other popular idea through history is annihilationism. So either you're in this place called hell for eternity, being tortured, and you're conscious of your torture, or you just don't exist anymore, which is annihilationism. So where do these come from? First is the concept of Sheol. The Old Testament has no references to hell whatsoever. Uh, it only has references to Sheol. Now, Sheol has been uh, uh, translated as hell many times, but it really is a state of nothingness. It's much closer to the ideal idea um, of annihilationism. In other words, that the soul, whether you're good or you're bad or whatever, it's that when you die, that the soul or whatever that thing that we call the soul is, just ceases to, or goes to a place of nothingness, or maybe ceases to exist. And it's like annihilationism, but adjacent to that, because Sheol could be a place where you're not annihilated, but that you're just floating in nothingness. That's the idea. That's the Jewish idea of the traditional Jewish idea of hell, or of what happens to you after death. It wasn't until the Maccabean period in the second century BC, that's when Greek ideas, there was a lot of Hellenization going on. There a lot of the concepts of dualism, of heaven and hell, which is, the ultimate dualism, comes from sort of that Platonic ideas that came from Greece, and Greek culture came into Judaism. And this is where the concept of Hades comes from. Hades is the Greek underworld. It's much more like the kind of hell we're talking about and that we think about. Now, whether you're in the underworld being tortured constantly, that that came a little bit later. But the idea of being separated from this world, with a dictatorial, mean god named Pluto and others, you were. This is the idea of Hades. Okay. There's a third major way. There are a couple of definitions, but a third major way of hell called Gehenna, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, many fundamentalists, uh, I would say traditionalists, think people like Protestants will say, "Oh yeah, hell absolutely exists," and this comes from basically the reformers. The reformers rejected a lot of stuff that they didn't like from the Catholic Church, but they kept stuff that they really wanted to keep. They kept some of the sacraments, they kept some of the ideas, but one thing they absolutely kept and they loved, especially Calvin, was the concept of hell. and hell as eternal conscious torment, basically coming from this idea of from Aquinas and the Catholic Church. So that's where we get that from. Now, modern fundamentalists and people like Tim Keller, who is who was a very influential author from the Presbyterian Church in America, which is a fundamentalist kind of Presbyterian, has spoken often, especially through the Gospel Coalition and other publications that he has done, spoke often that Jesus spoke more about hell than he did about heaven. And you hear this a lot in churches. Oh, Jesus spoke about hell all the time. That is a misrepresentation, and it's not right. Jesus talked about Gehenna, and Gehenna is not hell. It has been translated to hell, and we use that translation all the time. Jesus only speaks about Hades once in any kind of length, talks about Hades once in this story about in Luke that I mentioned, this story in Luke 16, the parable about the rich man who's sitting across the gulf, the chasm from Lazarus, his servant. Uh, that's where we get that from. It also is mentioned in the parable of the sheeps and goats about if you served the least of these, then you're on your way to heaven, and if you don't, then you're on your way to hell. That word Hades shows up there too. But every time when Jesus talks about being cast out into the outer darkness, being the gnashing of teeth, which we hear about. He's talking about Gehenna. Now, Gehenna is actually the name for the valley that's just outside of Jerusalem. There have been a lot of interpretations what he means by Gehenna. Gehenna has been described as a place of like a garbage dump or a place where dead bodies were thrown that were considered unclean or whatever. There's a lot of debate about whether that's true or not. It probably isn't true that it was a garbage dump or whatever. It was certainly, however, considered a place of disgust and uncleanliness. Absolutely that. So that's the imagery that Jesus uses. He is using it metaphorically. He's always using it saying that that they would be cast out into the outer darkness, meaning excluded from the community, shoved out, put into this place of shame and uncleanliness. Why did he say this? It's because for the Pharisees, for the Jewish people that he was speaking to, they knew what Gehenna was, and they knew that Gehenna and this concept of uncleanliness was utter disgust, utter banishment, being thrown out, right? So sometimes Jesus in parables uses that as a threat, but sometimes it's just saying, if you're not with me, if you're not with the Father, well, it's like being banished. It's like that, right? Nowhere is Gehenna anything to do with after you die, being in a place, a physical place especially, or a place where your soul goes, to be utterly tortured for eternity. Nowhere. That's not Gehenna. What it is it's maybe Hades. But what it really is it's an amalgamation of all of these things pulled together in order for it to be consolidated into one vision of hell. And that was not in Scripture at all. Was done slowly over the centuries using Augustine theology, but even Augustine didn't believe in it. But over the centuries, slowly was added and conflated, where it really became a visual representation to us in two places. One is Dante. Dante used this concept of 7 levels of hell. He may have gotten the idea from others, but he's using this political satire. The Divine Comedy is political satire, right? And he's placing all of these people that he didn't like, including leaders and popes and all of that, in these different layers of hell, right? As he wrote it. But that concept of being tortured really comes and was made very visual. The concept of torture was made very visual by Dante. And these images have persisted. And of course, we see it in a lot of paintings, and we see it in a lot of uh, um, other literature that happened after that. Because the Catholic Church, they go, rock on, this is great. We can use this imagery in order to scare people into submission, which is exactly what they did. That's the use part of it. It was very useful. And then it became very useful for the Protestant churches as well. They used it to build up, especially Calvin, and then after Calvin, especially the Puritans and people like Jonathan Edwards. I mean, Jonathan Edwards in America, really amped it up and made it a systematic theology that you're either going to go to utter bliss and incredible, beautiful bliss, or you're going to this pit of hell and the burning lake of hell, right? That's where that comes from. So that's why I'm very critical of Tim Keller and others like him uh, in this respect, because they talk about it as if it's a done deal. Jesus talked about hell; it's absolutely true. The Bible is completely consistent about hell. It's utter nonsense. It's a lie. Honestly, it's a lie. These are not biblical concepts. These ideas of Sheol, Gehenna, and Hades were pulled together by the church. They're not biblical by themselves. So then the second time that we really get a visual representation comes from Milton. And remember Milton, you know, uh, this is the time of the Puritans, and this is the time, when the Puritans were fighting the Anglicans and all of that. He, in Paradise Lost, used the imagery that we get from Luke 16, and he made it into almost an entire story, right? He he also conflated Lucifer, who again is just the morning star, just the angel that fell from heaven, um, and was actually conflated with Jesus in Revelation, and he pulled these together, the idea of Lucifer and Satan being the same thing as Lucifer, which there is no biblical comparison of Lucifer and Satan. There is no the devil and Satan, the serpent, and all of these different images of the evil one are not consistent in Scripture at all either. So all of these concepts that we have that we think are so settled aren't really there. They were developed by the church later. So this is where we get into Revelation. In Revelation, remember, Revelation was written to persecuted Christians in first century, maybe early second century Asia Minor. That's Western Turkey. Um, and it is a apocalyptic literature written as a tool of revenge and retribution, essentially, for the people. If you're being oppressed, if your people are being killed, if you're under constant threat, then yeah, you're really hoping that God will have retribution against your oppressors. That's what this is for. That was to give them divine retribution, divine revenge, essentially. And what better concept than the concept of hell? Or what was called the lake of fire. Eventually, Satan will be conquered and cast, and the demons will be cast in the lake of fire, and all the minions that support him will be cast in the lake of fire. This again became conflated with hell, and it's not the same. So we have to remember that Revelation is a tool for oppressed people. And then it was a tool that was picked up in order to be able to be used generally for everyone, in order to basically keep people in line. So this is how you get why did they do this? Now, of course, they did it in order to, like I said, support the authority of the church and so forth. But this is also how you get people to support things like colonialism, slavery, segregation, mass incarceration, just disenfranchisement, perpetuation of poverty. This is how you do it is if you can distract people from the hell on earth that we are living with today by saying, well, unless you toe the line, unless you're do the right things according you either do it by keeping up the sacraments if you're Catholic, or you do it by saying the Jesus prayer if you're an evangelical, or if you're a combo of those things. Unless you do those, you're going to go to hell. And what better way to get people to ignore the work and the heaven and the terrible things that we do here on earth than to get them to focus on the afterlife instead? As Amy Jill Levine says, maybe we should say to hell with hell, because it was a tool, and we should, maybe we should really consider it. So the concept of hell also can be used in terms of, and we can talk a lot about, salvation, when is it going to happen, and, and how does it happen, and so forth. But the real question is there a hell? Yes. Is there, yes and no. There, there's a hell because people believe in it, because people use it as a tool. Yes. No, because it's not in scripture the way people say it is. And it's certainly, because it's a tool, it's been made malleable, it has been changed, it has uh, made it. Now, before modern science, of course, people thought, well, the earth is flat, or there's the center of the earth. Um, and Dante actually thought the earth was round, but still there was a center, and I, but the thing is there was a physical place down below us, and there is a physical place above the firmament called heaven. So we that is built into our theology, you know, very, very firmly. So we believe that, oh, well, naturally, well, that's where you're going to go. You're either going to go above the firmament when you die, or you're going to go below the earth, and you're going to go into utter darkness and the pits of hell, down where the volcanoes and the magma and the brimstone is, right? As we came to discover over time, is that this is crazy, because we there isn't a firmament, and there isn't an endless pit. That these aren't physical places, and we knew this by the time of Calvin and the Reformers. The Reformers knew this, right? And certainly with modern science, we know this. So what do we do? Do we say that those places don't exist? Well, they don't exist physically, for sure, and we know that our bodies don't go there, right? So the concept of the idea of soul, that there's an everlasting soul that lives beyond death, and that it's your soul that goes to these places. But even the soul is not well defined. In Hebrew, soul is nephesh, and nephesh just means your being, who you are, right? It's not this floaty thing that goes to heaven or hell after you die, but okay, we picked up that concept and we turned it into something. So that's where we got this idea of, after you die, that it's no longer, you go to these places and that they're physical places, but that we go to these places, that your soul goes to these not physical places, or these places that, we can't touch and feel. And that's where heaven and hell, the concepts, come from. But the idea is it separate is I think that the thing that's so important to know here is that this idea of being separated from God is what we have in the New Testament, especially this separation. C.S. Lewis wrote The Great Divorce, and The Great Divorce, I think, has been helpful to a lot of people. Remember, everything C.S. Lewis is not theology, okay? He's a great storyteller. He told great stories, and they are helpful to Christians in their belief journeys because he is he tells these great stories that help us, right? But the Great Divorce is helpful in one concept, is that it says that hell, rather than being a place with torture, with pitchforks and devils, the hell is the separation, is this evil basically taking over and separating us from each other and from God. And that this loneliness, this being cast out, is what hell is. The good thing about that image is it's actually a lot closer to the concept of that we have in Judaism, this idea of being into a state of nothingness. It's it's not it's easier to believe. It's easier to understand in that respect too. You don't have to believe in red devils with pitchforks and in a place with brimstone as much. And that's where I think that the Great Divorce has been very helpful to people because it gives you the idea that being in community with people is heaven. Being separated from the community and being separated from God is hell. And and it's something that's like right in front of us and that we can deal with and do that. So while like I said, that isn't theology, but at least it is a helpful concept in this and helps us rationalize what these concepts mean. So I think it's really important for us to say this is a concept, it's not scriptural, it's something that's been given to us, and that we shouldn't live in constant fear of it. As I mentioned in my previous podcast about um, are you saved and what is salvation? Do you lose salvation? Things like that. Um, again, the goal is wrong if that's what your concern is, because whether you're going to go to um, eternal conscious torment or not uh, is really kind of the wrong question. The question should be, am I in relationship with God or not? Am I separated from God or not? And that's really the idea of Gehenna. If you're cast into Gehenna, you're separated from the community. You're separated from the goodness and the favor of God. Think of it that way instead. I think it really helps. Now, one last concept. The Catholic Church developed the concept of purgatory. And um, and purgatory is not in Scripture. Uh, and I used to be kind of, as a Reformed Christian, a Presbyterian, I used to look at uh, purgatory as nonsense. That's stuff that was just made up in order to be able to sell indulgences and stuff like that. But I read a book called Christianity: The First 3,000 Years by Darmaid McCullough, and that that book is wonderful, and he talks a lot about how the concept of purgatory came to be, and it actually. Uh, I realized that this concept of a loving God wanting to gather his people, wanting to gather God's people, all people, toward himself, gives the opportunity for us to become that through some sort of sanctification process. That's where the Catholic Church gets it. There are some scriptural ideas about sanctification. Certainly, there are Christian concepts of sanctification and perfection too, not necessarily related to purgatory, but the concept of sanctification, of coming closer to God and basically God giving second chances, does exist and has been in Christian theology for a long, long time. So maybe we should kind of rethink of that. There is a concept called universal reconciliation. Universal reconciliation is not the concept of universalism, nor is it the concept of universal salvation necessarily. But instead, universal reconciliation is much more common, I would say, in most mainline churches, in most non-fundamentalist Christianity today. Certainly, it's a concept that is accepted in some parts of Eastern Orthodoxy. The Eastern Orthodox um, uh, professor and author David Bentley Hart talks about the idea of universal reconciliation. And it makes a lot more sense about a loving God wanting to gather God's people. I often like to, and I'll end with this the thought experiment. If you're one of the 6 billion, almost 7 billion people in the world today who are not Christians, are you going to hell? If you are too young to understand who Jesus Christ is and what salvation is, are you going to hell? If you're unbaptized, for example. Um, if you were taught badly, many Christians are, you were taught a concept of Jesus you just can't abide with because that Jesus uh, may be associated with assault and violence and rape and all of those things, destruction. And you say, well, I'm not going to believe in that Jesus. Are you going to hell? You've got to ask yourself, what kind of God would say the people who've never heard, or the people who've gotten the concept wrong, or who have been taught wrong, or associate uh, Jesus with abuse and violence, all of these things that don't make sense for a loving God, are you going to hell? It doesn't make sense. So, does that mean that that hell doesn't exist or nobody? No, it doesn't mean that at all. But it does mean that we have to rethink our relationship with God. We have to rethink what kind of God does this. We have to rethink the what the Tim Kellers of the world of saying that we should rejoice in that, God has hell and sends people away to eternal conscious torment. And they go through all kinds of contortions to do this. John Piper, John MacArthur, all of these reformed guys really super fundamentalist reformed guys do this. They gaslight you essentially. They're saying, well, don't believe that this is bad. Don't believe this is a hateful God that's going to send you to hell. No, it's a loving God that sends you to hell. That's nonsense. It really is. So you have to rethink it. And that's what I would like to say is that in this case is recognize that hell was and still is a tool of conformity. It is used to push conformity with theology. It's not a place. And but if it is a place, or if there is separation from God, which is a lot more like the concept of Gehenna, and that idea that it's probably more like how Lewis describes it. Or maybe it's a place where we are separated from God, but that there is opportunity for discovering and to see the real God, and that the real loving God maybe we have an opportunity in the way that David Bentley Hart talks about being reconciled. And that idea of prodigal son, of being of the father welcoming the prodigal, even before the prodigal repents. Remember, the prodigal son repents, but doesn't tell the father until after the father embraces him. In other words, that grace was given even before even before. So that's where I think that we can say, well, that's the story. That's the God that we believe in. And that's the God that is consistent in Scripture, the God of second chances, the God of redemption, the God that sacrificed God's self for our sake. Why would that not be sufficient? Why would that lead people, especially unwillingly and unwittingly, to a place of eternal conscious torment? So, with that, I will say people say lots of things about the Bible, especially hell, that aren't really there. God bless you.